All right, let me just get set up here. We'll go live. I have to click something else here for the Instagram. Sorry, just 1 second, folks. All right, it should be working now. Sorry for the hold up. Okay, so let's get right back into the Gladio doc. So when we last left off, we were talking about Vito Genovese and how he died in prison. Um, he was in a solitary cell. He was taking medicine for his gallstones and was found dead. He had been placed there for protection, so the mob still got to him. The last paragraph I had read was that an autopsy later revealed enough poison in his system, quote, to kill 8 horses. On June 10th, Jerry Esposito, the second witness, was found shot to death beside a road in Norwood, New Jersey. All charges against Genovese were dropped. In a memo dated June 30th, 1945, Brigadier General Carter W. Clark wrote that the records regarding Genovese from military intelligence were so, quote, hot that they should be filed and no action taken. Again, that's what you do with hot records. You want to just file them, make sure you take no action. Hot seems like something I guess you have to leave alone because you're worried for your own safety. Interesting. So, yeah, that catches us back up. So I'll pick back up on. It looks like Vito Genovese. Oh yeah, so the Hellawell plan. This is the plan to distribute heroin to the inner cities. Required Vito Genovese, who was a known mobster who had the connections for this kind of distribution, that he return to the United States for the creation of a system of heroin distribution in the nightclubs of Harlem. So they needed this guy. Genovese was not the guy who died. Um, Peter Latempa was a key witness, and he was killed in his cell. And Jerry Esposito was also shot. So those are the people who would have prevented Vito Genovese from coming back to America. So now getting into the section Homecoming and Havana. In the summer of 1946, Luciano arrived in his hometown of Larcara Fridi in Sicily, where he received a hero's welcome. Hundreds of people lined the streets waving small American flags. A four-piece band played the Stars and Stripes Forever, as the mayor, draped in a red sash, ushered the American mobster out of a police car. Wild welcome for like an American mobster that gets sent to Italy. So, quote, half the people I met in Sicily was in the mafia, Lucky later reflected. And by half the people, I mean half the cops too. Because in Sicily, it goes like this. The mafia is first, then your own family, then your business, and then the mafia again. That's a hell of a hierarchy. In October, at the request of U.S. intelligence agents, Lucky traveled to Cuba, where he met with Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and Meyer Lansky to discuss the Hellawell Plan. Again, this Hellawell Plan being distributing heroin in inner cities through jazz clubs. Also in attendance were Mike Miranda, Joseph Magliacco, Joe Adonis, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Profazzi, Willie Moretti, the Fischetti brothers, heirs to Al Capone, and Santo Trafficante, all important members of the American Mafia. So they all are meeting in Cuba to discuss this plan for distributing heroin that they're getting through the CIA and the Vatican, and with the complicity of the U.S. military. It's like straight out of The Godfather, only more nefarious. The conference was held at the Hotel Nacional, where Frank Sinatra made his Havana singing debut in honor of Luciano. Several of the mafiosi voiced their opposition to Lucky's plan by maintaining that dealing in junk was beneath them. But at the end of the conference, all became convinced that providing heroin to blacks was simply giving them what they wanted, and who cared what happened to the N-words. The creation of the CIA. So this is the next section here. So yeah, you can see any pretense they had about some kind of ethics or code of morals among the mafia quickly fell away when they could make profit and also engage in racism. So the creation of the CIA. On September 20th, 1945, President Harry S. Truman abolished the OSS and placed its secret intelligence and counter-espionage branches under the War Department as the Strategic Services Unit. Within months, the SSU morphed into the National Intelligence Authority and the CIG, or the Central Intelligence Group, the precursor of the CIA. According to Richard Helms in his memoirs, General Vandenberg, the director of the CIG, recruited Allen Dulles, who had returned to his law practice in New York, quote, to draft a proposal for the shape and organization of what would become the Central Intelligence Agency, from the outline Wild Bill Donovan had created. So yeah, they're just forming this group. But you can see, like, from the very start, the creation of the CIA was to fight communists, was to harbor Nazis, was to engage in whatever nefarious, underhanded, human rights violating abuses they needed to generate the funds to be able to conduct these operations that they wanted to do. What's going on, people? People in the chat talking about Trump. Yeah, nobody likes Trump here. The book is It's Unholy Alliance by Paul L. Williams. It's about Operation Gladio. It's about the alliance between the Vatican, the Nazis, the Freemasons, the CIA, and the mafias of various European countries and the U.S. The proposal met with Truman's approval. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, was created in 1947 under the National Security Act to carry out covert operations, quote, against hostile foreign states or groups or in support of friendly foreign states or groups, but which are so planned and conducted that any U.S. government responsibility for them is not evident to the unauthorized persons. So yeah, just clandestine. That's a long way to say secret, black ops, stuff that we can't be known to be involved in. True to Wild Bill's vision, the new agency was exempt from disclosure of its, quote, organization, functions, officials, titles, salaries, or numbers of personnel employed. So you're not allowed to know anything about this group. For security purposes, of course. Even its solicitation and distribution of funds was to be concealed from congressional and judicial scrutiny. As Tom Braden, a senior CIA operational official in the early 1950s, explained, quote, the agency never had to account for the money it spent, except to the president, if he wanted to know how much money it was spending. Otherwise, the funds were not only unaccountable, they were unvouchered, so there was really no means of checking them. Since it, the CIA, was unaccountable, could hire as many people as it wanted, it could hire armies, it could buy banks. So yeah, in case people doubt the capabilities or the extent of what the CIA gets involved in, that's people who worked for it, admitting outright like the capabilities that it had. An elite agency, the next section here. President Truman authorized Dulles to supervise the organization of the new agency. In keeping with OSS protocol, Dulles recruited almost exclusively the nation's elite, millionaire businessmen, Wall Street bankers and lawyers, members of the national news media, and Ivy League scholars. The new recruits included Desmond Fitzgerald, Tracy Barnes, and Tommy the Corcoran, 3 Harvard-trained Wall Street lawyers, Richard Bissell, a Yale economics professor, William F. Buckley Jr., a Yale graduate and son of a prominent oil baron, Philip Graham, a Harvard graduate and future owner of the Washington Post, William Colby, a graduate of Princeton and the Columbia Law School, and Richard Mellon Scaife, the principal heir to the Mellon banking, oil, and aluminum fortune. So all these just like hoity-toity, waspy, very wealthy elites, like the monarchical families of the U.S., if there are any. Rear Admiral Roscoe H. Hildenkotter of the ONI became the executive director of the CIA, and former OSS official and Wall Street lawyer Frank Wisner was appointed head of covert operations. The first concern of the newly created Central Intelligence Agency was funding, since it had received no allocation in the federal budget, which would be solved with the implementation of the brilliant idea of Colonel Paul E. Hellawell. So yeah, we're just spending pages and pages basically outlining the creation of this plan to deal drugs, to secretly export drugs out of conflict zones, and then use that funding to conduct black covert operations, to murder communists, to do all these like assassinations and overturning of elections. If you guys look on youtube.com/TCOTEpod, that's my YouTube channel, and the link to all these PDFs is in the show notes in the description of the live videos. So let's see. The Hellawell Plan hits Harlem. During the summer of 1947, the terms of the working relationship between the CIA and the Mafia were ironed out by Frank Wisner and Angleton. This is James Jesus Angleton, of course. Meyer Lansky and Hellawell would work in tandem to handle the financial aspect of the narcotics venture through General Development Corporation, a shell company in Miami. Angleton would handle any legal disputes between the mob and the CIA through New York lawyer Mario Brode. The 200 kilos of heroin for the test run would come from Schiaparelli, one of Italy's most respected pharmaceutical companies. So they're starting out with like really, what do you call it, like industrial grade stuff that they're getting from an actual legit pharmaceutical company. That's how extensive their connections are. They can do something like that to start off. The product would be shipped by the Sicilian mob in crates of oranges. Half the oranges in the crates would be made of wax and stuffed with 100 grams of pure heroin. Additional heroin would be packed in cans of sardines, wheels of caciocavallo cheese, and barrels of olive oil. That's also funny too, because if you remember a few years back, there were all these like headline stories like in mainstream media about the olive oil trade and how people were getting all kinds of like fake oils designated as extra virgin olive oil, and that was a big scandal. And it makes you realize just how much more scandal is going on under the surface. The drugs would arrive in Cuba, where the heroin would be cut in laboratories controlled by the Trafficante clan. The drugs would then be shipped to New York for distribution in the jazz clubs of Harlem. Operation X, as it was called, got underway at the close of the year and met with incredible success. The future of Gladio and other covert ventures was no longer in jeopardy. Hellowell's analysis had been correct. The jazz clubs were perfect spots to peddle heroin. Soon some of the country's leading black musicians, Billie Holiday, Theodore Fats Navarro, and Charlie Parker, became hopeless junkies, some of whom would die by overdose. So yeah, if you think it's tragic enough that like so many musicians are plagued by this addiction, how bad is it when you realize that that was spawned by these kind of like Nazi shielding operations by the literal deep state? Regarding this development, Harry Anslinger, then head of the Bureau of Narcotics, said, "Jazz entertainers are neither fish nor fowl. They do not get the $1 million protection Hollywood and Broadway can afford for their stars who have become addicted. And there are many more who will ever be revealed. Perhaps this is because jazz, once considered a decadent kind of music, has only token respectability. Jazz grew up next door to crime, so to speak. Clubs of dubious reputation were, for a long time, the only places where it could be heard." Yeah, that was the quote from Harry Anslinger. So not my opinions on jazz music. That's like some stuffy CIA agent's opinions. Police protection, the next section here. Colonel Albert Caron, a New York City policeman, served the new drug network as a, quote, bag man for the CIA, paying law enforcement officials to look the other way when drugs were being distributed in Harlem and other black communities. A made man within the Genovese crime family, Caron also collected money for drug payments and later for money to be laundered by the Vatican from mafia families in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. In recognition of his service, the cop/bagman became a Grand Knight of the Sovereign Military of Malta, which has been described as the military arm of the Holy See. So yeah, if the Vatican has some kind of like military arm, it would be that. And for this New York City policeman to become some kind of honorary member should be suspicious, especially when you find out it's because of his literal illegal drug dealing activities. Protection of the drug trade would become reflected in the fact that not one major drug bust was conducted by U.S. officials from 1947 to 1967, despite the rise in heroin addicts from 20,000 to 150,000. The success of the drug venture heightened the CIA's concern with secrecy surrounding its ties to organized crime. At the insistence of Rear Admiral Hillenkoetter, the archivists at the Office of Naval Intelligence collected and burned all records concerning Lucky Luciano, including the terms of his parole. ONI agents now insisted that Lucky provided nothing to the war effort. Anyone attempting to unearth the history of the heroin trade in America would be hard-pressed to find facts. In 1954, when William Herlins, the New York Commissioner of Investigations, launched a probe into the matter, he was told that the ONI and the CIA would consent to cooperate under 3 conditions. No classified information would be turned over. ONI and CIA officials could monitor all interviews with former agents, and the final report could not be released to the public. So these are wild criteria, like stipulations that they're making. And then also the fact that like the mainstream political opinion of most Americans is like if they can't find a document, if they don't see a US document admitting to the wrongdoing, then they won't believe it. And so try to even bring up the fact that like US agencies like this have burned documents, have literally destroyed evidence of their own wrongdoing, and they can't wrap their mind around that. The American nationalism runs too deep. So this next section here is Red Alert. The overriding concern of the new intelligence agency was the situation in Italy, where the Italian Communist Party, the Partito Comunista Italiano, or PCI, was poised to take control of the government. This is one of the biggest operations of Operation Gladio. One of the biggest accomplishments was this very election. Between late 1943 and 1944, the PCI had doubled in size, and in the German-occupied northern half of the country, an extremely radical Marxist movement was gathering strength. In the winter of 1944, over 500,000 workers in Turin, waving the red flag, shut down the factories for 8 days despite brutal Gestapo repression. The Italian underground of communist sympathizers grew to 150,000 armed men. Post-war Italy stood poised to become the first communist country in Western Europe. Hundreds of thousands of Northerners had either actively supported or actively fought for the partisan movement that had finally forced the German army out of Italy. It was the partisans who had captured Mussolini and who had hung him upside down with his mistress. It was the partisans who continued to assassinate fascists after the war ended. And it was the partisans who constituted the PCI. By 1946, the division in the country had become acute, with the people in the north wanting a communist republic and the people in the south wanting a Catholic monarchy. So yeah, they have that same kind of division of the country between the conservatives and the radical leftists. And it's also funny too, people in the U.S. generally think of Italian politics as messy and just too complicated to understand. And it's usually the case that when that happens in a country where they have just some kind of perceived instability or inability to maintain a democracy, it's because the U.S. is interfering in it for anti-communist reasons. No clearer case than this. So someone in the chat says, African AJ says, I've gone through the Gladio working doc from your video. That's linked in the description here if you guys want to check it out. That's what I'm reading from. And he says, it's so absolutely damning. The lengths the CIA went to in order to avoid accountability, hiding budgets, hiring Wall Street elites, and operating as an unregulated imperialist force perfectly illustrate how capitalism defends itself through shadowy violence. This isn't just history, it's a blueprint of class war waged globally by the U.S. ruling class. Thanks for bringing these documents to light. Revolutionary work. Keep it up. I'm glad you like it, African AJ. Thank you for shouting out in the chat. Yeah, Enemy of the Fourth Reich says, do you record these? Yeah, they're all up on the YouTube channel. If you check out youtube.com/TCOTEpod, they're all under the live video sections. And then they're going up on the Patreon as audio, but then sooner or later I'll release them to the free feed as well. So back to the book here. In Sicily, the rise of the PCI was even more disconcerting. Girolamo Licausi, the island's leading communist, stirred up the masses with his demands for the redistribution of the land's feudal holdings. His words, "We plan no Soviet rule here," did not reassure the mafia and the propertied classes, and they revitalized the longings of the landless poor for economic reform. In 1947, support for the left, never previously strong in Sicily, skyrocketed out of nowhere. All of Italy was stunned by the provincial elections, which produced resounding victories for the communists. With national elections in Italy scheduled for 1948, U.S. officials were faced with the specter of a coalition coming to power under Palmiro Togliatti, the leader of the PCI. Togliatti had spent the war in exile in the Soviet Union. The first numbered document of the newly created CIA was a top-secret report titled, quote, "The Position of the United States with Respect to Italy." The report, which was issued on November 14, 1947, contained the following quote from a cable sent by George Kennan, director of the U.S. State Department's Policy Planning Staff. As far as Europe is concerned, Italy is obviously the key point. If communists were to win election there, our whole position in the Mediterranean and possibly Western Europe as well would probably be undermined. So yeah, that's document NSC 1/1, which, as he's saying, is the first numbered document of the CIA. That shows you their priorities. They started out being very concerned with a situation in Italy to make sure that the communists gain no power whatsoever. This next session here. Actually, let me see how long I've been going for. Yeah, I'll just go a little bit longer. I'm almost at 20 minutes for this book, and I'll switch over to the next one. So this next section, the dirty money. The heightened paranoia over the possibility of a PCI victory gave rise to the creation of the Office of Policy Coordination within the CIA. This office was authorized to engage, quote, in paramilitary operations as well as political and economic warfare. That's wild. They're just given that level of permission. The authorization for such covert action, according to CIA Director Frank Wisner, was included in a catch-all clause to the National Security Act of 1947, which granted the CIA the right to engage in, quote, functions related to, quote, intelligence affecting the national security. So just taking the most broad and sweeping interpretation of that one sentence and affording themselves all these powers. And nothing in 1947 seemed more of a threat to the peace and stability of America and the Western world than the threat of a communist takeover in Italy. In the eyes of Wisner, Dulles, Donovan, and Angleton, the only individuals with the means to ward off this nightmare were Lucky Luciano and Don Callo, and the new intelligence agency, thanks to Hellowell, now had ample cash to pay them. Of course, the money for the muscle could not be paid to Lucky and Don Callo and the Don Callo clan directly. It had to be channeled through a financial firm that would not be subjected to scrutiny by U.S. Treasury agents, Italian bank examiners, or national fiscal monitors. Only one institution possessed such immunity, and it was located in the heart of Vatican City. Yeah, so now here's where we get to some of the major connections from the Vatican, as well as like the Nazi gold that they started off with. So I'm going to bookmark this one here. And now I'm going to switch over to the Western Marxism book. Now, again, this is also in the description for anyone keeping up. This is Western Marxism by Domenico Losurdo and translated and edited by Gabriel Rockhill. So it's basically just a scathing critique of the Western left and their methods such as they exist. So continuing here. The opportunism of the Western Marxists that Losurdo critiques must be understood as an analysis of class interest. They are all professional intellectuals ensconced in elite networks in the global north and are part of what some call the new petty bourgeois, or petty bourgeoisie, meaning the professional managerial class stratum in the imperial core. Quote, afraid of proletarianization below, attracted to the bourgeoisie above, while often being resentful of its overlords, but devoid of a long-term collective political project. The new petty bourgeoisie sometimes celebrates jacqueries and supports greater access to power for its social groups. However, it does not generally seek concrete system change because, quote, it does not want to break the ladders by which it imagines it can climb. It is here that it becomes clear that many of the Western Marxists within this class stratum occupy the position of radical recuperators, presenting themselves as representing the interests of the oppressed, but devoid of a practical program for social transformation. They ultimately seek to recuperate potentially insurgent forces within the capitalist order by guiding the masses towards symbolic or discursive solutions, such as consumerism within the confines of the imperial theory industry. Again, just another perfectly scathing critique. This is every grifter. This is every person who claims to be a radical and then ends up voting blue. This is every person who claims that they want total systemic upheaval and radical change. And then as soon as you suggest anything beyond some kind of charity for homeless people or going to a protest, they get all uncomfortable and they say, I don't know about that. And they start calling people feds. These are the people who are going to, for whom their role in the revolution is to die in a massacre named after their town. This false solution to very real problems has the added benefit of bolstering the social standing of the petty bourgeois producers of these intellectual consumer goods. Most Western Marxists have understood, or at least implicitly, that in order to climb the social ladder in the capitalist world, they need to give to the system of knowledge production what it demands, in particular, opposition to actually existing socialism. In return for this, they will be festooned by the very system they feign to oppose. If they pursue their social ascendancy as the enfants terrible of capital with the rabid alacrity of Zizek, they might even make it, like him, into the list of the, quote, top 100 global thinkers. In Foreign Policy, a journal with ties to the U.S. State Department. This philosophic grifter's best idea, according to this magazine with links to the engine of U.S. imperialism, should be no cause for surprise. Quote, the big revolution the left is waiting for will never come. Yeah, it's perfect. Like that's Zizek's biggest proclamation is that the big revolution the left is waiting for will never come. That's perfectly, that's like exactly what they would want the left to believe. And that is exactly what the Western left does believe. And because they believe it, it is self-fulfilling. It is absolutely true. They will never get the revolution that they are wishing because they wish for an unrealistic utopian revolution that cannot be possible. Losurdo chose a different path characterized by profound integrity and a humble dedication to the emancipation of the global working and oppressed masses. Rather than allowing himself to be determined by the objective forces of his existence as a professional intellectual in the West, he engaged in a self-critical examination of the very conditions of possibility of his intellectual production. This was surely facilitated by his being in constant dialogue with political parties and the global communist movement. His work is thereby testament to the fact that subjective freedom is not enhanced by ignoring the objective forces that determine our thoughts and actions, but precisely by recognizing the extent to which our worldviews have been conditioned by social determinants. This form of objective ideology critique, meaning criticism of the objective determinations of our individual ideology, rooted in the economic base and global class struggle, is precisely what his work demands. So basically, that's another very long-winded but intelligent way of saying, like, you cannot pretend that your thoughts and all of your opinions and your political takes exist in some kind of objective vacuum where you have not been influenced by anything, let alone your conditions that you exist in. So it actually requires that you examine those conditions and then base your critique on that. What's going on, people? Tired Eye says, "Where's Mike? This is AI." Very funny. I hope you guys like that post. Since I've been calling out grifters, I called myself a Russian and or Chinese bot. I amused myself. I hope it amused somebody else. Like good comments in the chat. Glad to see people showing up for these. So yeah, back to the book here. I sort of chose a different path, as I said. The next section, finishing up that last section. This form of objective ideology critique, meaning criticism of the objective determinations of our individual ideology, rooted in the economic base and global class struggle, is precisely what his work demands. Those in the imperial core need to ask if their assumptions about the world are not largely a consequence of forces like the deep history of imperialism, of which they remain, perhaps willfully, ignorant. Yeah, and that's a big thing that I've been noticing among the Western left now. Is like if you bring up the class character that they inhabit, like the class that they belong to, and then how it prevents them from even imagining some kind of praxis beyond mutual aid and protest, well, they just get very mad. And that's because they have to remain willfully ignorant of this. So this next section, socialism or imperial barbarism in the 21st century. The struggle against imperialism for liberation from colonial or neo-colonial shackles, which is being carried out by means of political weapons, arms, or a combination of the two, is not separate from the struggle against backwardness and poverty. Both are stages on the same road, leading toward the creation of a new society of justice and plenty. It's a quote from Che Guevara. One of the dominant slogans of neoliberal ideology, proffered by Margaret Thatcher, holds that there is no alternative to capitalism. TINA. It is a historical irony that many Western Marxists who are nominally committed to building a world beyond capitalism nonetheless accept Thatcher's dictum, ostensibly desiring an alternative to capitalism while regularly denigrating historical efforts to construct socialism, has, in effect, produced an idealist version of TINA. The latter holds that the sole alternative to capitalism exists as an unrealized potential that only coheres in the ideas of professional intellectuals, but certainly not in the practices of people in socialist societies, unless, in extreme cases, they are consigned to brief eruptions in the past. This idealist anti-capitalism, hegemonic in the West's supposedly radical intelligentsia, not only acquiesces to Western imperialism's triumphalist claims about the end of socialism, it also often accepts the ruse that imperialism no longer structures political and economic relations around the world. Hart and Negri's Empire is one famous example of such an account. So I guess they wrote a very bad book describing the situation of the world and leaving out imperialism and foreclosing the possibility of existing socialism. These two tendencies go hand in hand, as the dismissal of imperialism undergirds the denigration of socialist states' struggles against it, including and especially via their efforts to develop in order to avoid being turned back into colonies or semi-colonies of the imperialist powers. Yeah, if you, as a socialist project, do anything that Westerners who are comfortably living off the benefits of imperialism, that they deem to be not leftist enough, not idealistically perfect enough, they will denounce your existing socialist project and demand that you return to a colonial state rather than exist as an imperfect socialist project. The confluence between this idealist version of TINA and support for imperialism is readily visible in the work of the illustrious director of the Frankfurt School, Max Horkheimer. Although he never tired of dismissing actually existing socialism as barbaric and even fascist, he declared his unwavering support for the U.S. anti-communist intervention in Vietnam. This was his justification, quote, "In America, when it is necessary to conduct a war, and now listen to me, It is not so much a question of the defense of the homeland, but it is essentially a matter of the defense of the Constitution, the defense of the rights of man. Some 30 years later, the co-author of Empire, Michael Hart, repeated Horkheimer's claim nearly verbatim. NATO's bombing of Yugoslavia, which was part of the neo-colonial, neoliberal counter-revolution and openly violated international law, was not, quote, the deed of American imperialism, he flatly declared, but was actually, quote, intended to safeguard human rights. And that's, again, the irony that, like, all these people who claim to be for human rights, or even just anti-capitalists who oppose American empire, or if they don't recognize it as such, they call it the American military-industrial complex because they think it's still some kind of simpler system of just bribery and corruption within the American government that causes it to go to war for oil or for other resources rather than it's just imperialism. It's actually much more simple. It's just a system of empire. Those kind of people will still end up sticking up for every American conflict. Those are the kind of people who sent for Ukrainian neo-Nazis. All you had to do is say Putin, Russia, and got these people scared. What's up, Shibbles? Good morning. Good to see you. Shibbles says people don't realize what their class orientation is, and that it leads to alienation, and thus have to consume. Yeah, and that's why leftism in America is a consumption. It's a consumptive product, and it's an industry. And it's not something that is ever going to lead to any kind of radical change because people are consuming it as culture. Let me check the Instagram chat, too. Tired Eye says, no shit, but it's doing what they got arrested for. If getting arrested on its own was activism, my name would be said next to Shay. Hilarious. Yeah, very good. Tired Eye also says, Mike, if you started posting on Spotify or YouTube again, we'll watch everyone. Yeah, I mean, they're all going to come out in audio format sooner or later. It's going to take a little while. I'm going to go through posting all the Patreon versions, like the longer versions of all the podcast episodes, and then I'll get to the reading hours after that. So I'm at 31 minutes here. I'll do 10 more minutes of this book. So Lacerdo's work offers an invaluable antidote to this anti-communist and pro-imperialist tendency within Western Marxism. He demonstrates how neoliberalism, which emerged in the 1970s and continues today, has always been an imperialist project aimed not only at rolling back gains made by the global working class, but specifically at countering the efforts of colonized and formerly colonized people to resist imperialist subordination. He also provides a sober historical materialist analysis of actually existing socialism, which makes patently clear that an alternative to capitalism is not just an idea, but a practical process that may be long, but is well underway. Hell yeah. Air horns for that shit. That's, again, why I just keep saying I support the existing revolution that is actually happening, which is the alliance of existing socialist projects and anti-imperialist countries that are not even socialist or leftist in any way in nature, but are against the U.S. merely out of self-interest or obligation because the U.S. has oppressed them for so long. They have an anti-imperialist character just in what they're doing, even if it's out of pure self-interest, because they do not have an empire. There are no other countries that are currently strong enough to have an empire. It is only the U.S. and the NATO empire that exists right now. And to support the current revolution of BRICS and the anti-imperialist alliance that are weakening that bloc. The People's Republic of China, speaking of, the PRC, the largest and most prominent socialist state-building project, is central to Lacerdo's understanding of the contemporary world. Man, I like this guy so much more already. He has mobilized his extensive knowledge to dismantle myths about it promulgated by the Western bourgeoisie and its ideological gatekeepers, notably that it is capitalist and imperialist. Gotta save that section here. Gonna be using that later. He has also foregrounded China's remarkable ability to learn from the successes and failures of socialist projects, including its own and those of the Soviet Union. Its ongoing revolutionary program is thus deeply rooted in what Lacerdo calls, quote, a process of learning and a long-term commitment to building socialism step by step. He rejects the tendency on the part of certain Western Marxists to fetishize and misrepresent the Cultural Revolution as a great but lost opportunity to create a revolution within the revolution. He also critically dismantles the widespread idea in the West that the leadership of Deng Xiaoping led to a fulsome embrace of neoliberal capitalism. Against these established Western positions, Lacerdo demonstrates how China's developmental project, not unlike Lenin's new economic policy in the USSR, has integrated elements of capitalism in order to develop the productive forces and gain access to the advanced science and technology of the West. As Lacerdo argues, Deng was integral to the project of liberating Marxism-Leninism from populist and pauperizing tendencies in order to develop socialism as the project of eliminating misery and fostering common prosperity. This does not mean that he idolizes Deng or simplistically champions him over Mao, nor does it imply that he misrecognizes the important foundations laid in the early decades of communist rule in China. It is rather that he advances a more dialectically nuanced understanding of the evolution of Chinese socialism that rejects the assumption, widely held in the West, that the reform and opening up constituted an abandonment of its fundamental principles. And again, I don't know if this narrative is propagated by the deep state, by like the CIA and like all the three-letter agencies that have an interest in making sure that the Western left hates existing socialist projects, especially China. But it doesn't need to be. Even if it's not intentionally done by some nefarious or clandestine forces, it's also just comfortable to the Western left. It's comfortable for their narrative. They would much rather see socialism be built by white people by themselves, um, or not at all, than have it be built by some people that they already have some kind of xenophobic opposition to. They're scared of Chinese people, they're scared of Russian people, they're inherently racist, and they don't admit that even to themselves, let alone to anyone else. So that manifests in the supposed principled opposition to China because it's not socialist enough. Meanwhile, they're still living in and supporting capitalism with their daily lives. For independent nation states that have historically been subject to colonial or neo-colonial domination, their struggle for national liberation has passed from a political military phase, Lacerda argues, to a political economic phase wherein the development of the productive forces is of paramount importance. Development is needed if these countries are to maintain independence and avoid being subordinated to imperialist powers through relations of economic dependency. It is also required to meet the needs of the people who have been subject to a great privation owing to the conditions of underdevelopment imposed upon them. Yeah, how else do you battle the underdevelopment that has gone on for centuries that we have all been talking about on the left for as long as we've been leftists, as long as we've been interested in anti-imperialism? How else do you combat that other than development? Underdevelopment requires development to be uh, healed, to be fixed. Let's see. Sorry, I'm probably not gonna keep on the Instagram chat. There's an active chat going on, but I'll let you guys have your own side discussion and not bog down the whole reading with it. I'm just glad to see the discussion. Glad you guys are talking. The PRC's gains on this front are remarkable, a fact recognized by sources that could not be suspected of pro-China bias, such as the World Bank. When the communists came to power in 1949, China was an underdeveloped country with a largely illiterate population that had suffered from a century of humiliation, meaning foreign conquest, capitalist rapine, and subordination to imperialist powers. In over 70 years of Communist Party rule, the country has been completely transformed. Life expectancy, which was only around 30 years in the late 1940s, has been increased to 77 years, surpassing life expectancy in the United States. Aggregating data from multiple sources, including the World Bank, John Ross argues that China's rate of increase of life expectancy in the 3 decades after 1949 was the fastest ever recorded in a major country in human history. Ross also marshals extensive evidence to demonstrate that, quote, in 7 decades, China's economy will have gone from being only 1/6 the size of the US to overtaking it. Incredible accomplishments. You just cannot say enough. You cannot overstate enough the incredible accomplishments that China has made building the socialist project since 1949. Shibble says basically bricks. And he says, oh shit, yeah. This has required monumental sacrifices on the part of the Chinese people, which is one of the contradictions inherent in socialist development, in part because it does not rely on colonialism like capitalist development. However, the government has also set its sights on overcoming these and other contradictions. In this regard, it has overseen the greatest poverty alleviation program in the history of humanity, lifting 850 million people out of extreme poverty, more than the entire population of Latin America. The PRC also launched the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, in 2013. There's also a funny side note that I just saw on Twitter this past week. Apparently, belt refers to roads, and then roads refers to seaway passages. I don't know why that's the case. It's got to be some kind of lost in translation thing, I assume, but it's just very funny. So they launched the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, in 2013, an ambitious project aimed at improving global infrastructure and fostering mutually beneficial economic growth. Offering a model for development that stands in stark contrast to the neo-colonial and imperialist paradigm promoted by the dominant capitalist countries, the BRI has attracted, as of fall 2023, the participation of 151 member countries. China has also been a driving force behind BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and other international projects aimed, among other things, at developing trade and organizational infrastructure for a multipolar world. So yeah, basically BRICS. This is all setting the stage for, and you can see like this is the kind of planning that you have to engage in. It's like if your supposed leftist revolution, if your supposed vanguard party, if your self-proclaimed movement is not planning on this level of like years to decades, you're not serious. Like you just don't have a real serious project that anyone needs to bother taking seriously or listening to the opinions of. Especially if they're criticizing projects that are actually doing this level of thing. The Chinese development model offers a crucial alternative to the capitalist West, as the Chinese Communist Party seeks a form of modernization characterized by people-centered development and the quote harmonious coexistence between man and nature. As John Bellamy Foster notes, China has implemented major ecological reforms, even as it has sought quote rapid economic growth aimed at bringing China up to a level with the West. These include, quote, pollution reduction, reforestation, and afforestation, development of alternative energy sources, imposing restrictions in sensitive river areas, rural revitalization, food self-sufficiency through collective means, and the reduction of reliance on coal. Moreover, the PRC acknowledges that economic growth will need to be slowed in the coming decades in order for China to meet its stated goals of implementing an ecological civilization and reaching net zero carbon emissions by the mid 21st century. So yeah, I guess that's what the part of the goal of socialism by 2050 is near net zero carbon emissions. In the next book that I'll read, the third book that I do every day is the Busy Worker's Handbook to the Apocalypse, and one of the biggest premises of that book is that net zero is a total like it's just a lie. It's just a myth that is not possible with the current trajectory of humanity or human technology. And it's also what the largest climate bodies like the IPCC are basing their projections on. So they're just flat out lying to us from the start. But that's for the next book. I still have a couple more minutes. Actually, no, I don't. I'm already 2 minutes into that book. So let me switch over to that book. I'm going to bookmark Western Marxism here. Sorry, folks. You see I'm just flying by the seat of my pants here. All right, so now the Busy Worker's Handbook to the Apocalypse. So now the section that we're on is metal in 2022 global reserves. Not really sure why we were talking about metal. Something about Dr. Simon Michaud of Finnish Geological Survey gave a lecture going over the global availability of materials needed for renewable grace ranges. Okay, so that's why. There's only so many amounts of metals available in the earth based on like projections of what people have pulled out of the ground so far, or however they study that. And more of that than what currently exists is needed to make all the technology required for solar panels or batteries or whatever else is going to be used in the supposed green transition. That is also one of the major assumptions of all the major Western climate bodies. Like they not only assume that people are going to be able to reach net zero by sometime like 2050, but they assume that that's going to happen with this green transition of all these technologies and green energy things. And we just don't even have the basic materials available on the planet, which is probably why they talk about mining asteroids and other stupid shit. Talk about like utopianism. Like literally the capitalists and neoliberals, it doesn't even work on paper, let alone in reality. A few key quotes from Dr. Michaud's presentation from an hour and 6 minutes, 25 seconds. The idea of growth economics is about to be phased out, whether we like it or not. The economic model behind materialism, consumerism, and the social constructs associated with that will have to go. We've got no choice there. The purpose of this work is to show the shortcomings of the existing paradigm. What will happen is we've got to make a better plan. Once we understand our true boundary conditions, what will we really do? 1 hour, 7 minutes 45, he says, the way I convinced my management was pointing out in 2024 or 2025, the captains of industry in Europe who are making electric vehicles and their batteries will turn to the geological surveys of Europe and say, why did you not tell us about this very obvious problem? So this book was written, I believe, in like 2022. So if anybody wants to do some Googling, see if any of the leaders and captains of industry in Europe have started approaching the geological surveys of Europe and saying, where are the metals? Why did you not tell us we were not going to have enough metals for all these things? I also did happen to see like a couple times over the last 2 years alone, all these, like, I think both China and the US said that they had discovered some like huge rare earth mineral deposits, which then also makes me think if those are like just totally fictitious stories and they're getting it from somewhere else and they're using that as the cover. Because once they discover any kind of like mineral deposits or natural resources, those become like state protected resources. Like those are secure areas. You're not allowed to go check it out for yourself. Another recent talk by Mark Mills, a mining industry expert and former CEO of a Canadian mining company, presents similar conclusions. Some key quotes from Mr. Mills: 12 minutes and 30. A movement in oil markets of 5% is massive. This is a change in demand from 700% to 4,000% in these metals that will be required in the coming 2 decades. If it were to be achievable, this would be the largest change in demand of metals in all of human history. It's never happened. People are suffering some delusions about what is possible in the mining sector. And at 15 minutes 20 seconds, he says, what we're proposing to do with the energy transition is you will increase the wedge in gray by 10 times. And so this wedge in gray, he's referring to this chart. Global materials used. Clean tech is a transition to solids from liquids and gases. So at the very top, it's metals. It's a very slim wedge of this graph. The middle one is oil, gas, and coal. That's the silver one, the gray one. Construction and industrial minerals. That's the orange one. And then biomass is green. So he's saying if you go with this green transition the way that everyone's planning to, you're just going to increase much more dependency on oil, gas, and coal. At 15 minutes 40, he says, the energy system in the future will require the extraction and movement of a quantity of materials equal to or greater than the quantities of materials that humanity extracts, moves, and grows for all other purposes combined. That's insane. That's absolutely insane. Like the energy will outpace all the needs of biomass, construction, and metals. Just the energy alone. 1740, he says, in simplistic terms, the world will be short copper in a year or two. Copper does not have a substitute. It's not replaceable. You can pick any metal. There's a shortage of all the metals in the coming years. I just saw a meme this morning of like scrappers like filling up an entire truck, like a whole truck bed with all this scrap copper. It was like a meme. But yeah, copper is very expensive right now. The average is about 16 years to find and open a new mine globally. The world is not even investing 10% of what is required in global mining expansion in order to meet the aspirations to have the world follow Norway. So yeah, the Scandinavian model globally simply not possible. Not in this current reality or on this current planet. We're short on midterm investment. That is the 2 to 5 year time frame in all energy markets, which translates into pretty bullish price impacts on commodities for a very long time. How long it lasts will relate more to politics than to what engineers can accomplish. Interesting. Yeah, all this stuff just paints all the hand wringing about Greenland, Canada, all the stuff that like, because what Trump, he calls them raw earth minerals because he doesn't know they're rare earth minerals. He's like kind of dumb. Yeah, all this paints this stuff in a new light, basically. Sorry. Oh, you guys, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I was sharing the wrong tab still. I hadn't switched over. My bad, you guys. Now you can see the correct book that I'm actually reading. So to conclude this subsection, once you understand that CDR is impossible, a renewable grid is impossible, zero carbon transportation is impossible, and therefore net zero is impossible, you understand that the purpose of the IPCC reports is simply narrative control. Okay, so yeah, here's that chart I was referencing before for people who couldn't see it. And then that other one. So yeah, that's what I'd said at the start of this. The IPCC narrative is based on false assumptions and lies from the start. So therefore, anything they say afterwards is going to be pure fluff and drivel. Section 4.4. What is the IPCC? First, the IPCC is not a scholarly body. It is not a scientific academy. It is a political body, an office of the United Nations. The I in IPCC stands for intergovernmental. It does not conduct original research on climate, but performs essentially a literature review, publishing its findings in regular assessment reports. The IPCC's contribution is in the various modeled pathways and global mitigation plans that it develops. Leaked draft documents from scientists working within the IPCC have revealed the influence of political lobbyists over the final text of IPCC summary reports. Quote, delegates from Brazil and Argentina successfully removed any mention of the negative impacts of meat on the environment. They also removed recommendations that people in wealthy countries reduce their meat consumption and shift their diets to include more plant-based foods. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia's delegates made changes throughout the report to position carbon capture and storage (CCS) as a climate solution on par with renewable energy, as well as removing calls for quote phasing out all fossil fuels. More discussion on political edits to the IPCC reports here, and it links to a video. Kevin Anderson is a climate scientist and professor who has been outspoken for years about the influence of global elites, commonly referred to as the Davos Group after the annual World Economic Forum meetings in Davos, Switzerland. He co-authored this 2022 article titled, quote, "We Must Disrupt Davos Culture to End Decades of Failure on Climate," which summarizes his 2021 research paper on the same topic. From the article, quote, "Whilst the expert community may be working quite impartially, it does so within highly constrained boundaries imposed directly through funding and indirectly through prevailing hierarchies. The prevailing narrative is that we now have to urgently harness society's economic and technological powers to gain control of the climate crisis and safely navigate the so-called Anthropocene. Central to this view is that we have no time to replace vested interests and question existing norms and power structures. In stark contrast, our recent paper concludes that it is exactly these interests, norms, and structures that continue to be a key impediment to meeting our climate commitments." Emphasis added. So yeah, that's basically just saying like nowhere in the IPCC report are they ever going to say you should do anything about the governments or business structures that are causing all the climate and preventing you from even saying in those reports that that's what you should do, is do something to curb those governments and businesses that are actually causing all the pollution. They're lying to you. At 4 minutes in this interview, Anderson states, quote, "The Davos cluster has set the current narrative, and it is supported by the expert community. The only way forward is going to be through different structures of power." BRICS. It's not going to be the countries that the West is friendly with. At 5 minutes and 40, "What these CDR technologies allow us to do is to, quote, not make significant changes today. It allows us to maintain the current narrative." And at 7:10, "In just a handful of years, this way of thinking, CDR, has completely colored much of the NGO community, the academic community, and the journalistic community. In academia, virtually all of the scenarios that we assume and develop now seem to use the language of negative emissions, or CDR, as if these things existed. By use of the language repeatedly, day after day after day, we have almost made them material as if they are real." And again, carbon capture storage does not exist. It's not a thing. They are just words of things that might occur in the future, but we assume that you can already buy them off the shelves and you can put them into your scenarios. This is so widespread, so ubiquitous that we are now unable to come up with alternative narratives from within the academic community. So that's bad news, folks. Like the fact that like even the mainstream narratives about climate science and climate change all factor in the inclusion of this fictitious technology, theoretical, that does not and still yet cannot exist. It's so widespread that they're not even able to build models without factoring in the sci-fi. Again, hammering the main point at 15:15, the expert community currently just reinforces Davos. In this recent article, Anderson calls IPCC climate modeling, quote, "as damaging to the agenda of cutting emissions as Exxon was in misleading the public about climate science." Yeah, I'd say that's a pretty accurate assessment of that. Let me see what's going on in the chat here. Foolish Moose says, "High hopes for the Chinese multi-inspodium reactor." Yeah. We need them to do something, else we're all screwed. Noam Chomsky is most well... Oh, sorry. Noam Chomsky is most well known for his theory of manufacturing consent. In this 1996 interview clip, Chomsky makes the very important point that it's not that journalists or scientists are deliberately lying or actively promoting a conspiracy to deceive and mislead the public. They're likely acting to the best of their abilities. The narrative shaping occurs in the hiring process. If you believed something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting. That is the way to understand the IPCC reports. These are Davos narratives to ensure that elite power is not challenged, regardless of what climate catastrophe may soon occur, and scientists are chosen to write these reports based on their agreement with the Davos narrative. So section 4.5, distractions. You will frequently see references in climate news to, quote, tipping points, and it is worth taking a moment to explain what tipping points are and aren't. It always seems like some tipping point is getting closer and closer, but hasn't yet passed, which means there's still time to fix things, right? Tipping points apply to individual subsystems. There is not one grand tipping point controlling climate change. There is a tipping point for the Amazon rainforest, for Greenland's ice sheet, There are separate tipping points for several major ice sheets in Antarctica, for Arctic permafrost methane, for the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, which stabilizes Europe's climate, for coral reefs, etc., etc. The way I like to explain it is to imagine putting a person in a giant pizza oven. There will be individual tipping points for when various different systems fail. The lungs will have their own tipping point, the skin, the brain, the liver, etc. Focusing on individual tipping points is a distraction. The only thing that matters is getting the person out of the oven as quickly as possible. Letting them stay in the oven and closely monitoring, quote, while their liver function is within normal range, would be insanity. The same is true with Earth climate. Precisely which individual systems collapse or don't, and in which order, isn't the point. The point is we've placed 1.1 trillion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. There's no way to remove it, and it's going to make Earth unlivable within the lifetimes of most of us alive today. Yeah. Great news. Great news, folks. It's all going according to plan. Going back to the carbon or the copper thing, Shibble says electricians and meth heads are affected the most. Yeah. Electricians need their copper. There really is no replacement for copper. Let's see. Milankovitch cycles are another term to just briefly touch on, as you may see it mentioned by climate deniers. Milankovitch cycles are regular changes to the Earth's orbit that influence Earth's climate on the order of tens of thousands to 100,000 year cycles. Yes, they're a real thing. No, they don't matter at all to our current anthropogenic warming, which is occurring practically instantaneously by comparison. Possibly the biggest and definitely the most pernicious distraction is overpopulation. The disparity in emissions and overall consumption between wealthy and poor populations is so massive as to defy comprehension. Climate change, past and present, is caused by the global wealthy. And here's the chart that I always reference. You can just see it's like a inverted, like Hershey's Kiss. It's like so weighted at the top. The top 49% of people, the richest 10%, are doing 49% of the emissions. That's how outsized it is. These disparities exist even within developed nations. The chart below shows the carbon footprint of various income groups within the EU. The top 1% emit more CO2 from the food they eat than the poorest 5% emit for their whole lifestyles. The top 1% CO2 emissions solely from air travel are approximately equal to the top 10% total footprint. It would be trivially easy to feed a global population of 10 billion vegetarians, see section 6.2.2, while even half that number of meat eaters is enough to destroy the planet. Overpopulation is not a problem. Problems are things for which you propose solutions. If you have 10 people in a boat and one person weighs 1,500 pounds while the other 9 people weigh around 100 pounds each, is the boat overpopulated? Using the language of overpopulation sets the target on poor, low emitters and enables fascist genocidal fantasies of the rich who would love to throw the other 9 people out of the boat. Using the language of overconsumption sets the target right where it should rightly be, on the wealthy high emitters. Overconsumption is the problem. Let's see. I'm actually at 58 minutes, but I'm just going to bookmark it here before I get on to temperature projections. That'll be the next section. And just because I want to make a quick side note and say, this just reminds me of that time that like I had been briefly working with that guy, Chris Jeffries, who runs the Homeless Romantic YouTube and all the various social media pages. And he just is an unwell, unstable individual who's obsessed with veganism and thinks it's like the solution to everything. He's like a liberal individualist. And he found veganism and it has worked well for him. So now he insists that that is like the solution to everything. And he got overly fixated on veganism and overpopulation. And then when everyone in my Discord server and all these other people were trying to just show him exactly this argument and the data to back it up that says that like overpopulation is not whatsoever a problem. And if you think that it is and keep insisting on it, you're just a low-key fascist. Like you're just a fascist sympathizer. And it's no coincidence. Like the people who are like insisting that only veganism, and if people just became vegans, that would overturn everything. They care more about animals than they do about people. It's like a liberal, childish, like Snow White version of like analyzing politics. Like, yes, it'd be great if people go vegan, but you're not going to fix the problem that way. Now, if you force everyone to go vegan, if you have some kind of like authoritarian maybe system that actually forces people to stop eating meat or can control the systemic production of meat, and the consumption, that would be a different story. But people are not proposing that. The vegans are not proposing that. The liberals who talk about overpopulation are not proposing that. That's why they have to get mad. Um, I'm so sick of all the people who I have encountered in the years of doing this who get mad rather than changing their mind when presented with the obvious data and facts that prove their biases wrong. It is like the critical weakness, among other things in like the Western left, is that inability to just analyze their conditions, analyze their rhetoric and the things that they believe, and how they've been led to believe those by the conditions they live in. And then they come up with bad conclusions, let alone bad praxis. Shibbles was thinking at the exact same moment. Yeah, it's hard not to think of it. Like, it was such a meltdown that lasted for weeks. It was so cringe. Um, I'm glad I don't work with that guy anymore, just like I'm sure everyone else is. But all right, I'm going to end the stream here. Thank you again for joining, everybody. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And these will all be up on the YouTube channel. If you just look on YouTube/TCOTE pod, you can find all the previous ones there. And I'll put out the audio